Dowdell had been working at a call center until March, when her father fell gravely ill.
I had to go to New York because my father wasn't expected to make it.
He had the coronavirus?
He did have the coronavirus. He caught that in the hospital, and he fought that, God willing.
Dowdell returned to Texas with a fever and self-quarantined for 2 weeks. She lost her job and fell behind on her rent. Her landlord, Issa Fazlalizadeh, gave her little leeway.
He filed eviction against you right in the middle of the pandemic.
Yes. I didn't know, because he didn't tell me that he filed. He kept saying, if you move out, you know, then there won't be any problems. You don't know what.
But this is the moment when Dowdell was confronted by her landlord in the driveway of her Houston home.
Unbelievable. So he's blocking the driveway so I can't leave.
Dan Lieberman joins me now. And Dan, I think we all want to know, how did that confrontation with her landlord end?
Hey, Allison. Yeah, he confronted her right there in the driveway, and she was scared. Her kids were scared, and ultimately she decided to move out a few weeks ago. She was facing an eviction. He filed an eviction case against her in the Harris County court system there in the Houston area, and rather than go to court, rather than possibly get a terrible mark on her credit and damage her future rental prospects, she decided to just pack up and move. It was a terrifying moment that her son did capture on video. She's staying with a friend right now. She had to pack everything up into a U-Haul in a moving van and move to a friend's place. She says that they feel homeless right now. They're looking for another house to live in. She's looking for a job still. She lost her job during the pandemic. It's been hard for her to actually get another place because many properties she's applying for are still asking for proof that she makes 3 times the rent. And during a pandemic, while she's on unemployment, that's just not possible. And it's not possible for many folks out there, Allison.
Oh, Dan, what a horrible thing to be going through at a time like this. I know you've been looking into evictions in the Houston area since March, when both local and federal protections took effect. What have you found?
Well, we saw in the Houston area alone that since the federal moratorium began in March, there's been more than 3,200 eviction cases that have been filed in the Harris County court system. That's the Houston area. That's a really high number. And what a lot of people don't realize is even though there's a federal moratorium that is in place through the CARES Act, that is really not covering a lot of renters. There's a lot of properties that are not covered by that. It only covers properties that have federally backed mortgages. And many landlords we found in our reporting in the Texas area are simply not following the rules. Many don't even know about the rules. And so it really creates this patchwork of problems for tenants and landlords as they try to figure out what the rules are. And now we're seeing nationwide that nearly half of the state moratoriums have expired. So you just have millions of people who are not covered, and we're seeing protests that are starting up here in New York and Brooklyn today as moratoriums end. So this is a nationwide problem, and until there's more funding, people like Erica in the Houston area can try to get local assistance from the city, from different organizations, but it's really just a patchwork. The money is gone in an hour and a half. There's not enough of it, and so there needs to be a much more robust federal response to help people in this crisis.
Yeah, Dan, let me ask you a little bit more about that. Is there specific help out there for people who are worried they can't make their rent? It sounds like from what you're saying, it's not a very organized or depth there of resources for people to go to seek help from.
Yeah, I mean, it's a real problem. And look, this is hard on landlords as well who have to pay their mortgages. And so, and what we heard from landlords associations was that it's in their interest to keep tenants, if they can, in place and to come up with arrangements with them, try to get on a payment plan. But in many cases, that's not possible. And until there is a more robust federal response, until there's more legislation passed, there is a bill, the HEROES Act, that's in Congress right now. It's stalled stalled in the Senate. It's on Mitch McConnell's desk, and it is not passing. And $100 billion of rental relief assistance is just waiting to pass in Congress. That would go a long way, but really it's going to take a lot of good politics, people coming together at the state and local level to really also provide more assistance for people, because we're now seeing a crisis where there can just be a wave of evictions in the coming weeks and months. Allison.
All right, Dan Lieberman, thank you so much.
You got it.
And you can watch more of Dan's reporting on The Report by NBC News. You just download the Quibi app.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.